Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm Glenn Fleishman. I am the author of an upcoming book, and it's called, uh, you can see it on your screen, How Comics Were Made. It's at howcomicswere made.inc. INK/KS will take you to the current Kickstarter campaign for this book. And the book is about how artists work, how the stroke from their pen or their brush went through the process of transformation from the 1890s to the present in the newspaper comics world, and even today to the screen. And part of this book is I've been talking to both for the book in preparation, dozens of cartoonists and other people in the comics world. And this is one of a series of interviews I'm doing with cartoonists about their careers and their work and how they make a stroke on paper and what they're doing now. And so I'm very happy to have joining me Barbara Brandon-Croft, who is the creator of Where I'm Coming From, I want to say legendary comic strip that was syndicated from the early 1990s to mid 2000s. Barbara, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It is such a pleasure. I was reading you in I think in Funny Times and in other alt comics and other weekly sources for years and years, and then I felt like I discovered one day. I said, "Oh, I'm not seeing Barbara anymore. Why is this?" And I know there were a lot of changes in your life that made that happen, and changes in syndication. But I want to start out by just telling people how exciting it is to have a book out in 2023. You can get your own copy. I'll put a better picture here up on screen too, which is a collection with some essays of your work, and get a copy of that book, and you can read the history of that strip and also about Barbara and her father and the place of black cartoonists in the cartooning world. And it's just a great book. I was glad to see it. So that's what led me to you. Was like, oh, this is great. So I'm always curious how you became, how you got involved in cartooning. What led you to break into this, this really weird and very specific field?
Sure. So, for me, my dad was a cartoonist. My dad was, I was immersed in cartooning. That was what my dad did all the time. I mean, he did other things, to make money. Like, he was an animator for motion picture, RCA, and then Bray Studios. But I was always part of cartooning, because my dad, and I'll just say his name and what he did. My dad was Brumsick Brandon Jr., and he did a comic strip called Luther that was syndicated with the Los Angeles Times Syndicate. And it was a daily strip that he did. And I did not think I was going to be a cartoonist at all. I was like, oh, he did that. That's his thing. And but I worked on his comic strip because as a doing a daily strip, I did a weekly. So for a weekly, I kind of took his method, his practice of doing 2 weeks every other week of Luther. So I did 2 weeks of Where I'm Coming From every other week. So that was two strips every other week. I could handle that, it was perfect. My dad, however, did a daily, so it was a lot of strips. Um, and he also he also was doing so many things. He was on a children's show in New York. It was a local children's show, and he did the artwork for that. He created he was a character on that show. He was really, really busy and needed help with doing Luther. So he gave me and my brother, I always say his kids, but I have a sister who did not participate. She
Not
didn't.
interested.
Yeah, she's like, I'm not into that at all. But my brother and I took this test because he wanted to see who could help him. And the job he wanted us to do was putting the Zipatone at the time on the comic strip. And so we had to, the test was to draw one of his characters on a light box. He wanted to see who had the steady hand and who could do it. My brother could not. He is a fisherman. He is a scientist. He is not an artist. So I won the contest, and I that's what I did. I as for my allowance, honestly, it was putting on the Zipatone on my dad's strip. I guess I was in junior high, maybe ninth grade, into the high school. Um, I put on the Zipatone,
Oh yeah,
and
I was going to share an image
oh yeah,
because I
yeah, yeah.
realize is This is funny. It's got so many names, right? Zipatone is what everyone calls it.
Yes,
Letraset made a version that apparently was more expensive, and then sometimes it's
correct.
called Ben Day screen from the old, like, which was an inked method that I write about I'll be writing about the book. But it's this thing where you cut out a dot pattern and then you lift it up, and then I'll show. I actually have another image which is great too. It shows like kind of how it's being laid down onto,
Yes,
this is a map, but it's the same thing as you're laying down this dot pattern to provide the sense of a tint. And so obviously, um,
yes,
oh, I've got, and here's a piece of a peanut strip, for instance. I took a picture at the Charles
yes,
Schulz Museum of Linus against the. This is a later one because Schulz didn't use tints until relatively late, I think, until the 80s, and
yeah.
so assistant actually would typically do the same thing, put the tint down to give it that sense of
Right. And
depth.
he used it by using those like cutouts of it. You could see it kind of gives it the mailbox a distressed look. It's
Yeah.
really kind of clever how he did that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and so this is you earn money working on, I mean, your father was a pioneer himself in a lot of ways, and there were not that many working black cartoonists for decades, but it seemed like, I think I've heard this from you and I'd heard it from other people too. It was like, well, if we have one black cartoonist on a comics page, then we've integrated the page and then we're done. And we wouldn't want to run a second black cartoonist because then that's too many, right? So your
Yes.
father must have had to contend with that across his career.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they were cartoonists. They were black cartoonists, but they weren't in the mainstream press. So for almost as many years as there were papers, there were cartoonists, black cartoonists doing black cartooning in the black press. And so my dad and was came along around the time in the late 60s around the with Maury Turner and Ted Shearer. So that's We Pals, that's Quincy and my dad. So they were the three who came around in the late 60s. And, arguably, it was a time when, the country was going through a social reckoning once again, and they felt they needed to put more images on their comic pages that reflected their readership. Um, and that's how those cartoons, those comics came to be. But yeah, he would often hear, "We have We Pals. We don't need Luther. We have um, Quincy. We have Friday Foster," which was another one, which was
Oh yeah.
yeah, Friday Foster was the character Friday Foster was a black woman, but it wasn't drawn by a black woman and it
Right,
wasn't
right.
by a black person, it's like it wasn't
Because
written or drawn
you
by a
had
black.
you had black characters increasingly appearing in comic strips, but not still in a very small number relative to all the comic strips out there.
Exactly.
And often, there's this thing I'll be writing about in the book is there's this transition period where you have only almost exclusively racist caricature depictions. Even when I was reading old Gasoline Alleys, like from the 20s, and the maid character is she actually says really smart things. Her dialogue is terrific, and you're like, but the depiction is worse than minstrel, right? It's this
Yes,
terrible thing. Like, I don't want to look at her, but what
yes,
she says is really smart. She's given respect in dialogue that she's not given respect in depiction. But then there's a point at which things change, right? And that kind of depiction becomes unacceptable on nearly any comics page, and you start getting more artists of color appearing. But it feels like there's, I don't know, 40 years, 50 years when you have a
oh,
gap between respectful depictions of people of color and actually people of color getting employed in larger numbers. And
yeah,
that's a bit where, you came in as there were no black women on comics pages were
right.
almost absent in any form.
and
And
and and to your point of saying that how they were shown visually, there was no difference between how they might show a black character, male, and a woman. They looked
right,
exactly the same.
right.
And just for your edification, it was in the 30s, the NAACP, you know, called these newspapers to account. You cannot just depict us with just black ink. And that's what used to do.
Yeah.
And they won and things had to change. And that's kind of where all that came to be. Um, um, it was with the help of the NAACP calling them out. And but that's the way it had been. That's the way it was. And once characters started coming in the mainstream, I'm going to say again, and that is with my dad and his crew. Not that they were a crew. They knew of each other. They corresponded, but they never really got together. And you know, uh, um, Maury Turner was on the West Coast. Dad was on the East Coast. Not quite sure where Ted Shearer was. I think he was
I
in the
don't
middle
know.
of the country. Yeah.
Well, I'd say one of the nice things about the digital era or the era of digitization is you can now search and find black
Yeah.
newspapers that
Yes.
were almost invisible. You'd have to go to specific collections to find them before. Now they're
Yes.
digitized, and you can see this panoply of what was going on that was outside the sort of national newspaper, major newspaper thing. There was an entire, as you know, there's entirely different set of publications, kind of like the Negro Leagues and baseball and so forth. It wasn't that people weren't playing baseball, wasn't that cartoonists weren't working, but it
That's
was
right.
invisible until it's exposed. And digitization has been one of those tools, it feels like.
To be able to see it. That's why, I can't help but talk about Jackie Orms. I mean, she was the first Black
Yeah.
woman in the newspapers. She was in the Black press, and my distinction is I crossed the color line. So, I'm like the Jackie Robinson.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, how did you get this strip? This is we've talked. I know you talked about it a lot, but I love people to understand. Like it's 1991 is when I'm coming from starts, and there's nobody looks like you in the comics pages at that
Yeah.
point. Really, I mean, there's a
Yeah.
few white artists drawing, often sidekick or friends or people in the office. Kathy Gies-White had added a black friend character, but
Yeah.
it's not obviously not the same thing. How did you get drawn into, hey, you should do a weekly strip, and we're really excited to get this out there?
Um, so, I'm a really lucky person. There's no doubt about it. But I started it for a magazine. Initially, I started for a Black woman's magazine called Elan, and the I got a meeting with the editor in chief. I don't even know how I managed that, but I did, and I was like, hi, I want to work for you. I want to, I was working as a fashion reporter for a trade publication in Manhattan, and which I was lucky to get that job. But I'm very lucky. I can't say that enough. So
It
I
sounds
get
like
it.
we make our own luck. It sounds like
Yes,
from your story too, but that's
yes,
good.
yes. So I get to meet Marie Brown, and I'm talking to her, and I say, I'll do anything, this is what I do at Retail News. She's like, you're kind of funny and you draw. Can you do a comic strip for us?
Oh yeah.
That's where it came from. I called it Where I'm Coming From. I decided it was just going to be Black women talking. And in my mind, it was going to be a different woman every time. You know, a magazine is different than a weekly. It's like that's once a month. I was like, can do. I can do a different comic each month. And I was excited. I showed her what my idea was. She loved it. She's like, let's do more. Let's figure out how to pace it in the magazine. And then the magazine folded. So
Oh.
that was the end of that. So it just kind of collected dust. I mean, I sent it to Essence in hopes that, I was like, well, that seems like a reasonable place that it would go. But they were not interested in putting a comic strip in the magazine. And they're like, well, you're not making it as a cartoonist. What do you do? And I'm like, well, I write fashion. And they needed their fashion and beauty writer was going to go on maternity leave. And they asked me if I would take a test to see if I could write for them. And I took the test. They liked me. And I stayed there for almost 6 years.
Hmm.
And so where I'm coming from is collecting dust. And when my dad got a letter from Detroit, Free Press, mainstream paper, and they're like, listen, we are in the hunt for a Black cartoonist. We want to have
Yeah.
Black cartoonists in our paper. Um, do you know of any? Ta-da. So here I am. And I was like, he knows me. And I say this all the time, but it's true. He said, are you going to talk about being a cartoonist or are you going to be one? And challenge accepted. I I sent them the very same strips and they liked it. And so I was in one paper, that was in 1989. So I was in one paper for a year before I got any interest from a syndicate. Um, I put together, I knew how syndicates work. They make press kits on the strips that they want to sell to newspapers. And so I made press kit of my work because I was already published. I was already getting feedback. All of that was, I could put all of those things in my press kit and I sent it to all the syndicates. Um, and even my dad's syndicate, he was with Los Angeles Times Syndicate. Reject, reject, reject. King Features gave me the best rejection letter. Jay Kennedy wrote me a page and a half of it wasn't a boilerplate. He
Yeah,
was
yeah.
thoughtful about what he was saying to me, and basically why it wasn't going to work. Um, but except for Universal Press Syndicate, and they, Lee Salem, miss him, loved him, was my champion, and he's like, I like it. Let's give you a development deal, which was easy enough for me because I would pencil in my strip. I would ink it in, send it to Detroit. I would send the pencils to Kansas City, and done deal.
That's
But it
right.
was
Well,
1991 when they decided to try to sell it.
you had a real leg up because you knew the business and you knew
Yeah.
what was expected of you. And I think I've told this story before on a live stream, but I was talking to Bill Griffith to Zippy the Pinhead a few months ago, and I confirmed the story with the other person in it. He said he wanted to be a cartoonist. He was a visual artist and he'd kind of thought about it. And so he looked at, I think it was Screw Magazine or something like that, like one of these things, but they were publishing cutting edge comics. He measured it out and he drew a comic to that size and he brings it in and he brings it to, the name will come back to me, to the editor at the time. And the guy says, well, it's not too bad and it fits, so I'll run it, because nobody could even do stuff to size. Like everything was always a hassle. And he's like, well, that's how he got his start, is he actually could meet the spec. And, of course he was doing interesting work and you're doing great work. He was at a different stage in his development career, but it's that, you knew what was expected of you, even making a press
Right.
kit, being able to support it. You make your luck when you meet what people think something's supposed to be. But
Yeah.
I was always fascinated. I remember every time I would see your comic in the paper, I thought, I mean, there's other cartoonists break the second wall, third wall, I guess, third wall in comics, right? There's two walls.
Yeah.
Nobody else was having people look at the screen, look at the viewer, and even more so, you had Black women's faces which weren't being seen, and many of them in a single strip because the large format, multi-panel. How, you talk about this as almost being a natural thing, but how did you come up with something that feels so different? How was this so natural to you to do?
Let's see. I was working on the idea for the magazine. I mean, had no ideas of what to do. And then when I thought I was going to have women just talking, I did steal from Jules Fifer. I love Jules Fifer, and I loved how on certain strips how he would have the character speak directly to the reader. I just love the intimacy of that, and I love the idea of people looking women in their faces, and not considering all their body and parts, and we're not. That's not all we are. We have things going on in our minds. So that's where I got it from. And that's one of the things that I was told that it's not going to work. That was one of
Hmm.
they're like, you have to have environments. You have to put them in bodies. You have to do all these things. I was like, but that's not the way I see it. That's not the way I want to do it. And honestly, I didn't, it is weird looking. It is odd looking. And when I was first asked about putting a book together, it's like, you can make a book of my stuff. I mean, if you're not reading it, then you're missing it.
Hmm.
You're just gonna see faces. And you're like, can you do pages of faces? Um, but I invite people to read it so they get what I'm trying to get at,
I
where
always
I'm
thought there's a
coming.
little animation aspect of it because you're seeing faces in different positions. So you can read the story. I mean, you have to read the words, obviously, you know exactly
Yeah,
what they're saying, but you're
yeah,
telling, I mean, as every good cartoonist, you're telling a story with the faces, but almost like, you could do a flip book of the comics and be kind of like, oh, I see what that person's going through. Now, I don't know the specific experience, but I think, and this is, I don't want to say it's transgressive, but I think, say 1991, the fact that you're showing all this natural hair too, and all these different hairstyles, which I want to talk about you and your father's exhibition because it ties directly into this. We'll talk more about that, but it shouldn't be transgressive in 2024 for people to express the hair of their culture, of their heritage, and that you have that kid in, is it Texas? I forget where he's like was suspended, even though the
yeah.
law should support him because he's using hair. It was, met all the rules. So
Because
we're still 2024, still is that word, right?
there
But
is
in
that's yeah,
1991,
yeah,
you're showing this in a national syndication. Uh, obviously an expression of who you are, but did you get pushback? Was there any sense of like, what, who are you showing here? But you knew who you were showing.
Yeah, I just kept going with it. I mean, even just getting Detroit, that one paper, there was editors there said, who's going to be who's going to be who is this going to touch? Who's going to read this unless it's Black women? And which of course I find insulting. I'm
Absolutely.
like this, what's going on with me is not of interest to anybody else but other Black women. It's insulting. So I just kept with what I knew, I just kept with doing what I wanted them to say or what was going on in my mind, what I found funny or what I found disturbing, and just talking, having them talk.
Yeah. Well, and you get through lots of real issues. I mean, some weeks are funny, right?
Mhm.
There's always, it's a comic. You were trying to structure on humor, but there's, if I recollect, right, there's abortion, there's pregnancies, there's abusive or neglectful boyfriends and partners. There's, all kinds of issues dealt with, but in that same kind of frankness, it's confessional. You're talking to me, and
Yeah.
and me as like a white guy in his 20s when I started reading it, it's like, oh, they're not talking. This isn't, these aren't people that I know, but they're
Yeah.
talking to me and they're welcoming me to hear their conversation. I'm invited in to listen, not to talk, right? And that was great. That was a great
Yeah.
position,
I
I
love
thought.
that you see it that way because that was the intent. And I did meet a young, um, everybody's young, but I did something at the Library of Congress. I was part of a panel for it was an exhibit on women illustrators and cartoonists, and one of the young white guys that worked there came to talk to me, and he was saying how much he enjoyed where I'm coming from. He said he grew up in a community that didn't have any Black people. He didn't know any Black people. He said, but when he read my work, he felt like he did. He felt like he was that they were friends, like he was wanted to hear what they had to say. So it's nice for me to hear that, that it came across that way because they were inviting. They even wanted to invite you to hear things that are uncomfortable for you to hear. You
Yeah.
know, that's what
There's
I
a key thing that I'm going to talk about in my book that I've been developing now, it feels like over months, and partly through conversations with you and other artists and historical research, is the tint issue. And you talked about you added tint to your father's cartoons, and I at some point I just like last year I thought, gosh, I need to talk about how when you move from a caricature representation of people of color to a respectful one, how you show the face without it being a caricature is really hard. And your father chose to use tint, and you told me this amazing thing I'm going to ask you to repeat is, so your father also drew for Freedom Works was a
Freedom
publication,
Ways.
Freedom Ways,
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry, Freedom Ways, which I still need to find. It's hard, that's actually hard to find digitized, but I've been going through online, and so he drew for that. And you said he met Langston Hughes, and what did Langston Hughes say to your father when they
Oh, I know what
first
you're
met?
talking about. Yeah, I know. So yeah, so this was Freedom Ways is this journal, this highbrow, journal. It's a literary journal. It does everything. But once a year they had it's a quarterly, and once a year they had my dad do cartoons for it. So they would have parties, and that's where I believe that's where he first met Langston Hughes, and Langston Hughes became a huge fan. He even one of the books my dad put out, self-published. We have a letter of what Langston Hughes wrote to my dad talking about, I love your book. Send me more. I want to sell it. I want to see it in every bookstore. I
Oh,
mean,
right on.
amazing to have Langston Hughes write my dad a fan letter, but that's truly what it is. But I think the one that you're getting to is that my dad did a caricature of him and sent it to him. He's like, "Oh, I love it. But why'd you make me white?" Because and my dad's like, "I drew it on white paper." What? That I mean, that was just like some kind of that was just fun between them, tickling each other, but it was an issue, right? The idea, do you put color on a character just to make sure that they're Black, or you know in my dad's time, that's what he chose to do. And so when it was my time, I used Letretone. That's what you were just talking about.
Yeah.
I used Letretone because the Zipatone I couldn't find, and it was expensive. It was like, I don't know, $7 a sheet. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah, so it's like, you can only use the funny thing about Letretone as well. Yeah, is that
Tiny pieces.
yeah, you have to keep the lines going. You have to keep the lines the same way. You can't say, "Oh, let me just use this little edge," because it'll make a swirly thing
Oh
when
yeah, the
it's printed.
dots, right? The
Yes,
dots
the
will
dots
all
would
look
do.
weird
Yeah,
if they're not all perfectly aligned. I wasn't thinking about that. Right.
if
You
they
have to
if
rule
yeah, you had to
across.
line up the paper the same way. I learned that doing my dad's. He's like, you can't turn the paper. It has to be this way. It's like, okay, but it also leaves you with a lot of extra, stuff that you can't use on that particular strip.
Yeah.
So I held on to it just in case it would work for something else. So I had stacks of Letrotone that had spaces, and I'm like, can I use this for this character? It's because it was expensive. But yeah, you couldn't use the same, you couldn't turn the page doing a Letrotone because it would
Yeah.
mess things up
Well,
visually.
and I break this up in part because we were talking a few months ago for the book. I'm looking at the strips, the newer strips you've done, which is exciting to me that there's some newer where I'm coming from. So I'll hold it up so people can see at home. So you took the tone out of your women's faces,
I
and I
did.
thought, well, this is everything is a statement. Unfortunately, right? Everything in representation is a statement. But it's what led you to say, well, maybe I don't need the tone anymore to show these people the way I see them.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be frank. It was cheaper. I, I didn't have to hunt down Letrotone. I didn't have to buy it. But I was like, maybe I don't even need it. The faces tell their story. What they're saying tells who they are. Um, Perhaps their hair even tells who they are. You could tell that these are Black women talking and that it wasn't necessary. And I think maybe I talked to was it Jerry Kraft? And he was saying he didn't use it, because he was like, that's a lot to do. And it isn't necessary on my characters now. I don't use it anymore. Um, I think about um, you know, people thinking that it's okay. I'm just going to go to blackface now. But when
Right.
like people doing, I'm going to be so and so for Michael Jackson's sake. Maybe not Michael Jackson. Let's use somebody else. I'm going to be Whoopi Goldberg for for Halloween, and then putting on blackface.
Yeah.
Thinking that's what I mean. If I were to say I'm going to be George Washington, I'm not putting whiteface on. You know what I mean? I'm like, I'm not trying to change my color. It's missing the point. Blackface is not necessary. I didn't think the coloring was necessary anymore, and it was cheaper.
That's great because you're still working. You're traditional working by hand and scanning in strips when you're doing work now, if you're producing new work.
Yeah, I do. I still work the way my dad worked, keeping notes, penciling it in, using a light box to ink it in, and then coloring in maybe hair or doing like Lakeisha has these stylized dreads. That you have to color that in, and so that's the way my dad worked. So that was the way I did it, and that's the way I still do it. I mean, I don't have a syndicate now, so whenever I do it, it's just from my heart and putting it out there because I need to get it out.
Well, I will tell you, it's been fascinating interviewing cartoonists who work across, some folks I've talked to are in their 70s or 80s, and some are in their 20s. And it's surprising to me for those raised in kind of the digital era. So many people are working with traditional media. So you have artists who are in their 20s and 30s are like, well, of course I'm working with a pen because it gives me happy accidents or because of this or that, or I can't, and there's even things I think cost wise, like a Wacom Cintiq tablet is very expensive to get a good one and of the right size, but
Yeah,
paper is relatively cheap compared to a Cintiq tab. I said this to someone, they said, well, it adds up over time. You use enough Bristol board, it'll add
yeah,
up to the
yeah.
cost of a Wacom. But so some of it is
Oh,
even
well,
like
it's
I can
expensive.
use the materials that I have available to me and not as much of a commitment, right? The digital feels like it's all done. And if I'm working on, so they'll do penciling, they'll do sometimes do the lettering digitally and or scan it in or what have you. So it's kind of I thought, well, we're in this digital revolution. Most artists will have converted digitally. Some of the artists who have been working for a long time might have switched over. And it's like, no, the digital part makes working in traditional media easier. So I'll be covering this in my book too about how many people are like, oh, this is great. Now I can work in watercolor, which I've always wanted to. I don't
Yeah.
have to work with a black line anymore because I can scan. That's
Yeah.
exciting.
It is. I mean, if I wasn't so resistant because, I'm like a toddler at heart, I was like, not change. I don't like change. I like to do what I know. I'm resistant to use that. But what I do also like about the way I work is that you have originals. When
Yes.
it's very nice to see all the spelling errors and whiteout that I have on my on my every strip I do. I always mess something up. There's always something that I have to correct. And it would be easier. It would be, if I were doing it, digitally. But digitally, is that right? Yeah. But I do like having the originals as well.
Well, I've talked to a number of people who said if they don't have originals because they're still working the con circuit or have patrons or whatever, and they don't have anything to sell because you
Yeah.
can sell a print, but maybe someone will pay $20 for a digitally printed item, but
Right.
maybe they would spend $200, $400 for an original. And I should say, people watching this, you can see behind Barbara are an array of this original work everywhere. It's much more fun to put that on the wall than a digital photo. Yeah, it's no, I think we're in a great age where people can choose what they do, and a lot of people are choosing traditional media, which is just I think it's kind of fun as a thing. So I'll try to be covering that in the book too about how the transition just didn't mean because a lot of people I think have just assumed everyone had to go digital. It's like, well, scanning is digital too. You can be using
Yeah.
whatever you want, and some people say they tried to start working with the stylus, say, and they found it broke their whole writing process. So
Mm.
they needed to actually revert to working by hand or with conventional media with
Yeah.
ink because or something else because they couldn't write digitally. It didn't connect in their brain the same way.
Yeah. I can't say it will because I haven't tried. But
But
because
it
I am
works.
resistant. Yeah.
It works.
It's
I was going through Nicole Hollander's some of her papers at the Billy Ireland Library. She did the cartoonist for listeners who did Sylvia, another wonderful and totally challenging strip compared to everything around it on the daily pages. Sylvia did not look like it. And what's funny is I said to my wife, who is not a big comics person, like she read them, whatever. I said, do you remember the strip Sylvia? And she goes, Nicole Hollander, like that. She hadn't thought about her for 30 years. Like, yes, it was that important. In her dorm in college, they had books of Sylvia lying around, right? So,
yeah.
but looking at her papers, this is one thing we'll lose too as comics historians. And also see you lose as a cartoonist is I was looking through her drafts. And so even she'd send stuff off to the editor. She was rewriting scripts, reworking things, even kind of up to the final publication. So and it was, I mean, I think these were things where an editor wasn't saying you should change this dialogue, but Nicole was still revising, trying to perfect at that point. And so as a historian, I look at that, I go, oh, this is great. I can see how she was thinking, how that evolved on this particular, maybe a sensitive issue or a joke. But if it was
Yeah.
digital, unless you keep
You miss
your,
it. Yeah, it's
yeah,
gone.
there's
Yeah.
ways to record your drafts and like, I can't remember the tools, but there's tools that will record you as you go. But then
Yeah.
who's going to look? It's
Goes
not the
back
same
through
story.
that. You don't know
Yes.
which ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
I keep
Um,
I work on tracing paper actually, when I'm putting together a strip. And sometimes I can look back and see, I'll read it over again and say, no, let's change that. Like you could say that more succinctly. All these kind of things. So and I keep everything because I don't know, part hoarder. But I have a lot of it, of stuff of me going through the process of trying to come up exactly with what I would like. Even now, even though it's only for me, well, I share it, but it's not a deadline I'm on.
Speaking
Yeah.
as your readership community, we would love more of it, but I know maybe that'll
Oh,
happen.
oh,
This is a nice thing, I think, too, maybe as a cartoonist, is that, you live through different eras, and now all these museums, institutions want your work, right? Is at some point you're going to get knocks on the doors or you could make calls. I was just visiting with Brian Bassett, who does Red and Rover. He lives just north of me, and
uh-huh.
he had piles of stuff. Lined up because he's donating his materials to the Billy Ireland, and Billy
Yes,
Ireland
me
has a
too.
hundred. Oh yeah, see that's great. So there's a home. So this is Mort
Yeah,
Walker and Brian Walker. I think they are two of the most significant people, along with Lucy Caswell. Shelton or Shelton Caswell, I'm getting her name wrong. Shelton Caswell, who founded the Billy Ireland
yeah,
basically because they kind of came up not with the notion, but they did the work that this stuff you create should be preserved. And
yeah,
before I don't know, the 80s or 90s, it was kind of like, well, maybe we'll just throw it all out. Like, no. And
Yeah,
so now it's a great
honestly,
transition.
my dad, well, I'm going to go to Billie Ireland in a couple of days,
Yay.
and to see everybody there, and they are really special to us, and um, to me and my dad. They have a bunch of Luthers already, in their vault, yeah, and they're interested in everything else, and they're like, I was like, do you read everything? They're like, everything. It's like, everything. They really are interested in his paintings, in his sculptures, in his notebooks,
Oh, it's
in
great.
his they just so they can. Um and they want my stuff too. So I was like, yes, so me and my dad will live in the Billy Ireland at some point. Yeah, so it's really, really a special place, and they are the handlers of the still exhibit that of my work and my dad's, that has gone places, has been in rotation.
Yeah,
You know,
I'd like to talk about that. I just one note before we talk about that is this is I'll
yeah.
tell a practical example is I have a set of Doonesbury comic strips from the
Oh,
1970s. I just did a video that people can find on YouTube through
oh,
what you're
good.
looking at right now about the week in Doonesbury that wasn't. He had to pull a week of strips about John Ehrlichman in 1973 because Ehrlichman abruptly resigned. And because of institutions, Trudeau has donated all his stuff progressively to Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. The people there are lovely. And so I emailed them like, do you have his notebooks? So like, yes, here's scans of the weeks that he was working on those strips. Oh, do you have this letter from John Ehrlichman to Gary Trudeau? Like, yes, because he donated it. Here's a scan of the. Do you have the
Yes.
originals of the strips that didn't run? Yeah, sure. Come on in person, and we'll pull things. You're like, oh my goodness. So I can tell a story that,
Yes.
and I've gotten comments from Gary as well. I can tell a story about this historical event through comic strips because an institution said, yeah, we want to keep all this. We want to archive it, make it accessible. And without that, we'd lose this kind of. I mean, it's maybe a small piece, but there's a
Yeah.
lot of other pieces. There's tens of millions of stories that would all be
Yeah.
lost because that original material isn't available.
And Gary Trudeau was the best. I mean, he was with the same syndicate as I was,
Hmm.
with Universal Press, and I met him back, during those days, and he was very encouraging. He invited me up to his studio. I got to see, where
Awesome.
he worked, and I hadn't seen him in years, and then last year I went to a lecture, and he was there, and
Oh,
he came up to me and he was like, Barbara? I was like, yeah. He's like, it's Gary. I was like,
I
Gary,
haven't seen each other in decades, right? Yeah.
it was really, really sweet. He's just that same guy all the time. He's good.
It's
He's a
wonderful.
good.
He's famously doesn't give interviews really, very rarely. I think he was burned too often in the early days,
Yeah.
but he's been extremely supportive via email. He's given me a lot of information. He's going to give me the rights to reproduce thing, or allow the syndicate to give me the rights to reproduce material, so I'll be able to tell this whole story and other stories because of that. So even if I can't get him on the phone, that's fine. He's being so generous about like you
He's
know
great. He's a great
whatever.
guy.
Yeah.
Great human.
Well,
Great
I want to
human.
talk about still because this was a reintroduction to me of your work. Is so as a reader, we're reading. I'm a voracious comics reader, like cartoons and at one point comic books, but I'm much more of a newspaper and web comics reader now. And
Yeah.
I remember seeing your work and I'd see it weekly and whatever. And then at some point it's like, oh, it stopped running, and I'd kind of lost touch with the alt weekly and like these funny times. I had a subscription for a long time. That's where I'd get a lot of strips that didn't run in my local dailies or weeklies. And so I walked into Billie Ireland a couple of years ago and I'm like, oh yeah, I know. Oh, that's her. And then and that's her father. And it was so exciting to me to see and your work juxtaposed. How did this exhibition, it's a traveling exhibition, it's now in its third location. How did this
But
exhibition come about to pair your work and your father's work?
well, my dad passed in 2014.
Mm.
But before that, I said, Dad, we should do a book. I was like, this would be a great book. We'll put your stuff next to my stuff. We talked about a lot of the same issues. Um, and we got a lot of similar responses, favorable and not so favorable. And he's like, yes, let's do it. And I said, okay. Had no idea how to make a book. So it didn't happen. And then I met Tara Nakashima Donahue, who's had a gallery. Her parents had a gallery in New York. And when they would allow her, I guess, once a year to do, her passion is cartoons, comics. And that's her, that's so whenever once a year they would allow her to put together her own show. So she contacted me to do because she was doing women in comics. And and I was like, okay. I was like, I don't have anything new. My strip has been over. She's like, we can show stuff you've done. I was like, all right, you know. And but we developed this relationship, and I told her of my idea, and she found out more and more about my dad. We did a couple of other before still and other um, shows showing my dad's work and then showing mine, that kind of thing. But then we talked about, I said, I think it would be interesting if we could put dad's work, my work, we're talking about the same thing. And the focus of Still is racism in America. And that's the name, Still Racism in America, a retrospective in cartoons. So we came together, and she's an incredible curator. And we group things together. Oh yeah,
I'll just
that's how
share
it
a
appeared
picture.
at the Billy Ireland. Yeah,
Yeah, you
because
can
that was
see
the
it's
second place it went. And what we did was show his work, my work, and the only thing that was next to the pieces was the year that it was done. And many people have been like, if I hadn't seen the year, I would have thought that was written yesterday.
it's
If I,
chilling.
yeah, if I didn't see the years, I wouldn't realize that what you talked about and what your dad talked about, me in 1960, him in 1967, me in 1997, same thing. Over, we just talked about, we talked about it a little bit differently, but it was the same topics. So we are lucky enough that right now it's at University, UC Davis in their design museum.
Oh, that's
And it's
great.
I hope to keep it moving around because it really tells the story. It tells the history. And it kind of, if I do say so myself, in a kind of profound way, it really it has I have seen people get emotional just going through
It's a
the
heart
exhibit.
punch because if, as much as you want to believe that society's progressed, you look at 50 years of work between the two of you and you say, actually it's just, it's harrowing, right? And that's what you need to tell people, especially
Yeah,
white Americans who
yeah,
want to believe things have changed. We need to be reminded constantly, well, that's, we're not seeing it, where it's
yeah.
invisible to us. The racism becomes more and more, it's not right now, it's not that invisible,
Not so
but
much so now. Yeah.
became more invisible, and it heightens it. But I thought one of the things that was great was to see that your father could say during his lifetime, it's like in the 60s. I'm like, I didn't know that you could publish this then. I would have thought he would have been so pilloried for being that honest in that period of time, but obviously celebrated because his career went on for decades after it. So it's kind of a good wake up call to say these
Yeah.
things were being said then too. It's not like they were only being said in 1990 or
Well,
2010.
guess what? The things that the most incendiary things that he would talk about, he would do that in the Black press. So a lot of the work in there
Right.
is was from Freedom Ways.
Hmm.
A lot, and also this consumption of Black newspapers called Black Resources. A lot of it was Black Resources. When he did Luther, that was for a mainstream syndicate, Los Angeles Times Syndicate. So he did talk about race then, but he did it in a more subtle way, that would be more palatable to the masses, make sure, white folks didn't get offended or,
Too much, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So you could see that in his work as well. Yeah.
I don't know if it's too early for you if you've had a chance to digest your trip to Nigeria, but I know you just got back not long ago. You were sent, the State Department sent you over there, and I wonder what was that like? Had you been to Nigeria before? What did you encounter there in terms of like who you were meeting, cartoonists, or just the cultural interest in your work?
That was incredible. I was stunned and amazed, once again, and lucky because I got a notice, an email from the State Department asking me if I would join their speaker program because they had an invitation from Nigeria consulate, the U.S. consulate in Nigeria, to come out there and do a workshops on editorial cartooning. So my cartoons, my work is, I never know how to, nobody knows what to call it, but I'm always honored when they see it as editorial cartooning. That's an honor. But they asked me if I would go there to talk about editorial cartooning, and I was like, sure, so we had to go through all the making sure it happened, passport renewed, la 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 la. Anyway, I go and I was there for a week and I was so busy. But the bulk of it were these three workshops that I did with um, their National Cartoonist Society. They invited um, editorial cartoonists from all over Nigeria to come to attend this program. And there were like 25 cartoonists. Some were
Amazing.
emerging cartoonists, some were established, some were legends. It's like, and I did not, I told them, I was like, I am so honored to be here. I've never been in a room with so many editorial editorial cartoonists, certainly not editorial cartoonists of color. It was, and what else I liked, which I felt humbled by, is that I was like this catalyst to get them all together. They knew each other, they saw each other's work, they may have emailed and things, but a lot of them hadn't seen each other face to face. And so I just joined in with them. I felt like I was part of the crew, and there were three women who felt like they were emerging cartoonists, and I just was so touched when one of them told everybody that she came to this thinking that she was an aspiring cartoonist, but she left feeling like a cartoonist, so that made me feel really good. We did projects, we did there was like I never liked competitions like this, but we'd put them into groups. Some of the older guys with some of the people who were just trying to make it, and groups of like five, and everybody had to come up with a cartoon, editorial cartoon, either a series or a single panel, however they wanted to do it. And then we got to judge them at the end, which made me uncomfortable because they were all great. Um, but
Everybody
one
wins.
did win. Yeah,
Uh,
everyone did. One group won.
how
But
much of a culture of mentorship is there in cartooning in Nigeria, or did the people talk about that?
yeah, so that was 3 days, and the fourth day was like a
Yeah.
culmination of everything and awards and lots of ceremonies there, which was really great. But I also got to visit a school of creatives, and I got to go to an animation studio. Um, and we were in the animation studio, we were around a table and we talked, I told them my story, I was asking them their stories, and everybody had the same story, that they felt that they needed to do cartooning or animation, they needed to be an artist, and their parents are like, you need to do science, you need to do, and a lot of them, there was one that's pre-med, and she's like, but I can't help myself, I have to do this art. So I told them how fortunate I was to have a father as an artist. I was encouraged. I always had supplies. I always had everything I needed. They took that extra step to make sure they could still do their art. And that was an important thing. So many creative people there. It was amazing. And that high school, we say high school, I don't know what they call it. It's different. But they were, between, I don't know, 17 and 21, maybe college age. But it was a college of creatives, and it was a giant auditorium. I thought I was going in to talk to a few students. It was an auditorium of all these. I was like, holy smokes. But it was really great to talk to them, and they were very excited to hear somebody else's story, and I was able to encourage them, stick to it, don't even, if it's in your heart, it's in your heart, you have to do it, you know.
How many different jollof dishes did you eat though? Was it like 100 over a week?
Yeah, and I'm such a picky eater. So I'm like, oh my God,
Do
this
you
is so
like goat?
tasty.
Do
I
you like
was
goat? I hope, right? Or no? Or you do now? Maybe not.
I did try to try everything,
Yeah.
for the workshop they always fed us lunch, and the first day the woman who did was the cook, she was like, how'd you like it? I was like, it was a little spicy. I felt like I hurt her feelings. I was like, oh no. And then by the last day I was like, I finished my whole plate,
Oh,
even down to the bone. And she just laughed because I don't know, I maybe I developed I could eat spicy food a little better, but it was, yeah, it was really cool. It was
That's
really
great.
cool.
I've wondered too, as I know Nigeria is a very complicated political entity, right? And
Yeah.
how much discussion did you have about being able to be frank versus maybe allegorical or kind of hide your meaning? Did that come up a lot?
Yeah, no, and we had all these discussions about things like that. And how do you know if you're going too far?
Mm,
What can you, what kind of topics? And I learned so much about Nigeria while I was there, of course, and the corruption and that's no news to anybody, so they're democratic now, so they do have a certain degree of freedom of speech. Um, and uh they are careful about what they say, depending on what paper they're drawing for, um, depending on just like here, it's like that was the other thing is that you kind of we discovered that we were living the same lives, we all have to, walk on minefields, you know,
Yeah.
eggshells, however you want to put it. You just I'll say this, I'll try to say this as plainly or as I can without getting anybody too upset and without losing my job, which is what they complained about. Like
Yeah.
you want to make sure you keep your job. I had done a editorial cartoonist panel in Charlottesville, and there were two um, cartoonists from Central America. Both of them had been exiled from their
Oh
homes.
my gosh.
Yeah, so, for their cartoons. And so I shared that with them, and we did talk about how difficult it is, but how empowered you feel when you um, you press somebody's button. You feel empowered.
I'm just impressed that there were at more than 2 dozen editorial cartoonists. I mean, Nigeria is a big country, but I mean,
Yeah.
given how few there are left in the United States, I think they might be doing a lot better than us per capita in terms of
Yes.
being able to express that, because there's so few newspapers run anything except a handful of people, and all the people running are kind of, I think a lot of the strongest voices in America had to water themselves down over time, or were canceled, or a lot of those
Yeah.
retired and nobody came up. So it sounds like Nigeria may have a more robust editorial cartoon
I
environment
was
than we have
amazed. I
here.
was like, you guys are blowing me away. And some of them
Amazing.
have resorted to showing their work online,
Hmm.
because newspapers didn't want to use them, or I heard a lot of, there was a lot of discussion about how to get your work out. Yeah.
That's exciting. Well, a whole new continent, whole new country, whole new continent of work to come. And so people should find your exhibition, you and your father's exhibition, UC Davis. If you're in Southern California, go there. You should get a copy of Barbara's wonderful collection with essays and original work. I was so delighted. It was a wonderful thing to revisit and then get to meet you online. And I'll just plug my own campaign very briefly. Is How Comics Were Made. I've talked to lots of people, Barbara and lots of other folks, done a lot of historical research, and this campaign, as I speak, is still going. Afterwards, you can pre-order a copy if you're watching this later. Just go to howcomicsweremade.inc.ink. If you add a /KS, it takes you to the Kickstarter campaign while that's active. Barbara, it is such a delight, as always, to speak to you and to
Oh,
learn more
you're
about.
doing such important work, and I appreciate it. Thank you for
Thank
including
you.
me. Yeah.
I can't do this without people's interest, and we're getting close to the top on the Kickstarter campaign. So everybody find Barbara. Also find Barbara, I should say, at her website. You can just go to barbarabrandon.croft.com and